Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Please take your seats. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Doug Miller. I'm co-chair of the Foundation of the Jewish Federation's Professional Advisory Committee. Along with Justin Goldman, my co-chair, we're delighted to welcome you in person and via Zoom for our annual tax seminar. We trust that this morning's program will be informative and add value to your practice and your clients' interests. Just before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Feel free to help yourself to the refreshments and coffee in the back. They'll remain available throughout the program. Restrooms are in the back through the foyer, and we'll field Q&A following the formal presentation. And for those on Zoom, feel free to use the chat feature for any questions. Please silence your phones. And for those wishing to receive continuing education CE credits, please make sure you sign in at the appropriate list in the foyer. If you pass that, you can go sign in now and sign out at the end of the program. And I'd like to ask Eric Brandt, the director of the Foundation of the Jewish Federation, to make a few brief comments. Eric?
Brief. I have 10 pages. You're not here to listen to me, so I will be brief. Doug, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. It's a great day. I'm glad you take time out of playing golf to be with us. I also want to acknowledge the State Planning Council of Rochester, who's worked with us in the Monroe County Bar Association to help put this event together, and also Alesco Advisors, who's underwriting this morning's event. Just so you know a little bit about the foundation, we have about $50 million in assets. We have over 100 donor-advised funds, restricted funds, but 9 supporting foundations, a combination of bequests, all other types of vehicles, life insurance, trust, etc. Our overall mission is to help secure the Jewish community for the future. Donors to our foundation make gifts not only within the Jewish community, but also outside to all types of 501c3s. So keep that in mind when you work with your clients, please. Essentially, we work with the Jewish phrases tikkun olam, is to heal the world. And that's what we do, not just within the Jewish community, but also outside. This morning, as we're gathered here, we know about the war in Ukraine. We've raised over $1 million at the Jewish Federation to assist you with Ukraine efforts. That's not just the Jewish community, but also others. Just a brief moment, if I could introduce our CEO, Meredith Dragon, who's in back. Meredith, say hello. Unfortunately, Meredith is not able to stay with us this morning. She has another meeting with one of our larger foundations in town. Meredith, you just want to say a couple words?
No, just my appreciation for everybody being here and participating, and thank you for your time and attention, and everybody's hard work in this room. This is incredibly hardworking, wonderful bunch of people, and we're privileged to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. And next to Meredith is Debbie Goldberg, our Chief Philanthropy Officer. I just want to acknowledge Debbie. I also want to thank Joy Ryan Plotnick, who will be helping us out with a few slides after our formal presentation to make sure we cover continuing legal education credits. Thank you, Joy. Liz Thorley with the Estate Planning Council. I turn it over to you for a couple logistics.
I want to remind everyone that for your CE credits, attorneys on the virtual presentation will have a link to fill in the CLE codes that will be distributed during the presentation, and then everyone else should make sure they complete the speaker evaluation in order to get your CE credits. If you are attending in person, please make sure that you fill out the green sheet on your table, and attorneys need to sign the yellow sheet on your table. Housekeeping. So, if anyone has questions on this, you can go into the chat feature in the virtual presentation, or ask our Terry from Rivers Organization if
Thank you, Liz. Before I turn things over to Justin, our other co-chair of our committee, I just want to point out, obviously you have packets on the table that contains all the slides in today's presentation. You can take notes on that. Feel free to take it with you. Please do, so I don't have to take them back to the office. Also, they'll be available online, and we are recording today's session. Justin.
Good morning. My name is Justin Goldman. I'm one of the co-chairs of our committee along with Doug Miller. And I'm thrilled to have the honor of introducing our guest speaker this morning, Jeff Levine. Personally, I have followed his work through webinars and certainly on Twitter for many years. I had the pleasure of attending one of his talks in Syracuse about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think it's wonderful to have him here in Rochester today. Jeff Levine, who has more designation initials after his name than letters in his name, you can all read that inside the packet, is a nationally recognized and award-winning financial advisor, speaker, and educator. His official title, the lead financial planning nerd at kitsis.com, home of the popular Nerd's Eye View blog, and he also serves as the chief planning officer for Buckingham Wealth Partners, which is an advisory firm based in St. Louis. In 2021, Jeff was named to Investment Advisor Magazine's IA 25 for being one of the top 25 VIPs pushing advisors forward, which followed being named to the same list in 2020 as one of the top 25 voices to turn to during uncertain times. Also in 2020, Jeff was named by Financial Advisor Magazine as a young advisor to watch. He is a past recipient of the Standing Ovation Award presented by the AICPA Financial Planning Division for exemplary professional achievement in personal financial planning services, and is a member of the 2017 class of 40 under 40 by Investment News, which recognizes accomplishment, contribution to the financial advice industry, leadership, and promise for the future. Previously, Jeff served as Ed Slott & Company's chief retirement strategist, where his ability to simplify the complex laws that govern individual retirement accounts, combined with his unique blend of humor and tax planning, was first recognized. Jeff continues to be an active speaker, traveling the country each year to educate thousands of financial planners, CPAs, attorneys, and consumers on retirement, tax, and estate planning strategies. Jeff is the author of the Financial Advisor's Guide to Savvy IRA Planning. He is also the creator and program leader for Savvy IRA Planning, as well as the co-creator and co-program leader for Savvy Tax Planning, both offered through Horse's Mouth, LLC. Jeff is a regular contributor to various industry publications such as Forbes, financialplanning.com, and has promoted retirement and tax education on television stations such as CNBC, Fox Business News, CBS, and public television. He's regularly sought after by journalists for his insights and is frequently quoted in publications around the country, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, New York Times. Pretty much I'm looking at a list of every publication that you might have ever possibly seen or heard of. Now, despite the fact that he is a dyed-in-the-wool Steelers fan, I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming Jeff Levine to Western New York.
Thanks so much. That was awesome. Good morning, everyone. That was awesome. All right, well, that about wraps up our time. It is so good to be here. I haven't been to Rochester. I was just sharing. I don't think I've been to Rochester in 20 years. My college girlfriend actually lived here. I think that was the last time I was in Rochester. So it is great to be back here on such a beautiful day and for such an awesome cause. So it is going to be fun over the next hour and a half or so, and that's what I hope. I hope when you leave here, you'd learn something, and that is obviously why we're all here. But I also hope you leave saying, that was fun. Because I know, for me, one of the things that I never really liked going to CE presentations is I felt like it was kind of like listening to Ben Stein, you know, on those commercials like dry eyes, try clear eyes. And it was 2 hours of that. So hopefully together we can have some fun. I'm going to modify what you heard in the introduction by just one minor detail. As an attendee, the other thing that always drove me nuts is if I had a question 5 minutes into a presentation and I had to wait an hour and a half to ask it, by the time I asked it, the speaker was 40 slides ahead. I didn't remember half the question I was going to ask. So I know what time we've got to finish. I promise I'll finish on time. I will do my part. Here's what I ask of you. Ask your questions if you have them, when you have them. Let's do it while it's up there on the screen, while we're talking about that. If you're listening online right now and you've got a question, type it into the chat box. And who's asking chat questions? You are. Okay, perfect. And we will get the chat questions asked and answered while you have them. If we need to move on, or if you become that one person in every room who asks 1,000 questions, we'll do it. We'll make sure we get through. All right, so having said that, I always like to set up this particular discussion where we're talking about 10 IRA errors advisors must avoid with a little bit of a little context, and that is, I hope when you leave here, and my goal when you leave here, I should say, is not that you leave and go, wow, that guy was right. I was making 10 horrible IRA mistakes with everyone I meet, right? Like, that's not the goal. However, my goal is I hope that you pick up a few things, one or two things here or there that color your understanding of a particular topic differently, or open your eyes to a particular idea a little bit a different way than you thought of before, or maybe possibly realize that something, one or two things you thought were one way are another way. The other thing I want to focus on is that we're going to cover a variety of different topics. This is kind of like a greatest hits presentation, if you will. So some of these will be very tax focused, some of them will be more on the trust and estate side. That said, I want to emphasize that some of the things that we cover are going to be the things that people think are simple. And some of them will be the things that people know are complex, like trusts for IRA beneficiaries. But if I can illustrate to you that the simple things are really difficult, well, then what does that mean for the things that we all know are difficult? And of course, when you're talking to clients, that's largely your job, right, is to illustrate. If you want to grow your business, your job is effectively to perturb individuals to the point where they realize, wow, this is more complicated than I thought. I might need someone like you who understands this better than I do. So, having said that, we're going to dive right in, and we will start with our first item here, which just happens to be charity related. Oh, before we go on, a reminder, Joy is here, and if you have any questions or answers, she must facilitate them. I don't know, did I do my appropriate disclosure here? All right, we are good to go. All right, fair enough. So, having said that, let's start with the failure to maximize the use of QCDs. By a quick show of hands here, how many are using QCDs regularly with clients? Oh, it warms my heart. Very good. You know, I'm probably preaching to the choir here and saying that we've got to use these things for just about everyone who's giving who's 70 and a half or older. From a tax perspective, I can't think of a better way to give for someone who is 70 and a half or older. There is no better way. Even appreciated stock, not as good. QCD's the number one best way, and it all comes down to a football analogy of all things. Now, I'm glad you brought up football because I'm going to start here talking about football. By the way, how many are football fans here? All right, pretty good. All right, so do you remember the football game from a few years ago? It was Super Bowl, so it was a pretty big game. And that team, and I think I'll actually have some common support here, but that team, the Falcons, was beating up on that other team that begins with a P. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about, right? Yeah, the enemy of your enemy is your friend now, right? Ah, yes. Well, remember that team was crushing them. The Falcons were really, in fact, anybody remember the score at halftime? 35-3. Anybody other guesses? 28-3, 28-3. I heard a bunch of 28-3s. 60-3, almost, it seemed like it, right? Do you realize that none of us in this room know the answer to that question? Well, one person does, right? It was 21-3. Now, here's the thing. You all were rooting for that other team as much as I was, I think, right? Or the Falcons, I should say. And this is the most watched sporting event every single year in America, and it was a historic comeback by that other team. I won't mention their name. If I do, I'll turn to stone like Voldemort, right? You can't say it out loud. Well, why is it that none of us remember that score at halftime? That's right, who cares? Somebody said, who cares? It doesn't matter, right? It couldn't matter less. In fact, after halftime at 21-3, Atlanta scored, made it 28-3, early in the third quarter, and then that other team did all the really terrible things they did to come back and win the game. But none of us remember the score, and the answer is, who cares? It doesn't matter. And that is true with just about every single thing in life, the halftime score not mattering, except when it comes to taxes. With taxes, the halftime score is often the most important score of the game for many of our clients. Now, what am I talking about, halftime score? Well, think about it. Let's go back, if you want, to 2017. You remember the real 1040? What was on the bottom of page 1, or if you want to be a rebel, the top of page 2? AGI, literally halftime on a client's tax return, right? We have taken some of the deductions, but not all. And yet, when we think about the importance of the numbers on a client's tax return, the taxable income, that end of the rainbow income, it only impacts really two things. It impacts what tax bracket you're in, which obviously matters, and then the QBI deduction, for some wacky reason, is also keyed to taxable income, right? That 20% business income tax deduction. Other than that, think of everything that you know, every credit you know that gets phased out, every deduction you know that gets phased out, every surtax you know that gets phased in. Heck, even things that aren't taxes, like Medicare Part B premiums. They don't care about the score at the end of the game. They only care about the score at halftime. So if your client decides that they want to be a great donor and make a big third or fourth quarter donation to the Federation here, that's awesome, and the Federation will be happy to have their money, but it does nothing to change that client's halftime score. So all those bad things we just talked about still can be impacted. I'll give you a quick example. Imagine you have a client, we'll make this a really simple example just to make the point, to illustrate the concept. You have a client who's 69 years old, right? And this year, in fact, let's make them 71 since the RMD changes. 71, your client is 71 years old, and they have $250,000, and it's all interest in the bank. So I guess even at today's now inching up interest rates, they've got like $4 billion in the bank, right? All right. So they've got $250,000 of interest. The 3.8% surtax doesn't begin to impact a married couple until they exceed $250,000 of income. So if that couple just had that $250,000, even though it's all interest, even though they've got great income for a retired couple, they owe $0 of 3.8% surtax, right? But if you are someone with $4 billion in the bank, maybe you also have a decent sized IRA, and once again, just to keep our math easy from a concept perspective, let's imagine that they have a $100,000 RMD the following year when they turn 72. And they go to one advisor down the street, and they say, hey, we'd like to make this $100,000 donation to the Federation. What do you think? And the advisor says, well, when you take this money out of your IRA and put it in your bank account, you're going to want to make sure, first off, write it as a check. Don't give cash. Whoever would give $100,000 cash, but write a check, right, to the Federation. Let's make sure we photocopy the check. When you get the bank receipt back, or your statement, we're going to make sure that we put that in your records. The Federation will probably send you a nice letter saying thank you for your $100,000. We're going to laminate that, so if the IRS asks, we can give it to them like a placemat. It'll be beautiful, right? And you're going to get a big fat $100,000 deduction. It's going to be great. And then they walk down the street to your office and they say, I always like to do my due diligence. I was talking with this other advisor. Do you have any thoughts on the best way for me to give? And you say, actually, I've got a great idea. I'd like to have you give $100,000 without any deduction. And they look at you like you've got two heads. Like, what do you mean? You want me to give away $100,000 and not get any tax deduction for it? But here's the thing. If they go to that individual down the block and they take the $100,000 as a normal RMD, right? And then they write the check, what's their halftime score? $350,000, right? Because that charitable deduction, will they get a $100,000 charitable deduction? Sure, right? But remember, it's a third or fourth quarter deduction. So their halftime score is still $350. Now, just in the context of the 3.8% surtax, that means that couple would owe $100,000 times 3.8%, or $3,800 of surtax unnecessarily. Whereas if they had just listened to you, the advisor who said, you know what, don't take a deduction, just give it to charity from your IRA, not only would their end of the game score be 250, but their halftime score would be 250 as well. And again, I'm making an exaggerated, egregious example just to illustrate the concept, as I will do several times this morning. But the concept is the same. I mean, even for lower income clients, right? Think about it from a perspective of how much of their Social Security is taxable, right? That is key. And when I say lower income, it doesn't mean they're low income. It just means their income is low that year, right? Maybe it's one of those gap years between retirement and taking RMDs, but their income is low. We could make more Social Security. I mean, everything that we can think of except for the QBI deduction in the tax bracket is keyed to that halftime score. Even many jurisdictions have property tax breaks, particularly for seniors who have lower incomes. And that is almost always, in every state, it's different, but it's almost always keyed to AGI, or some version like modified AGI, but almost never is it taxable income. All right, so having said that, I realize I'm preaching to the choir, and it's a good reminder that I've only given you the best case scenario. We've only talked about the halftime score. Today, with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, right, with the standard deduction being as high as it is, and if you're a married couple and you're both 70.5 or above, it means you're also both 65 or above. Right? So your standard deduction this year is more than $28,000. Let's give them the $10,000 of state and local taxes. Where are they coming up with the other $18,000 plus of deductions? Where? Probably not from their home if they're giving away a lot of money. They've either paid off that mortgage, so there's no interest, or they're at least on the principal end of that loan, right? It's probably not medical deductions. They're on Medicare, and they've got a great Medigap policy in most instances, so they're low out of pocket compared to their income. Where are they coming up with the other deductions? So in those cases, not only are you increasing the halftime score, but you could be increasing the score at the end of the game if they're not truly getting the deduction for it. All right, so having said that, and again, preaching to the choir in the sense of using QCDs, that's great that we're already there. Let's talk about some of the rules, and I want to focus on just a handful of them where there seems to be more confusion. The first is, in the very first year a client is eligible, the year that they turn 70.5, there are a lot of failed QCDs because people move too quickly. Right? We think about the old rule about being 70.5. And if I turned 70.5 today, what was the first day this year that I could have taken an RMD? January 1st, right? Didn't matter, just in the year. But when it comes to QCDs, QCDs can only be made when you are actually 70.5 or older. You must actually be 70.5 or older, which means if I have a client who turns 70 or who turned 70 this year on June 30th, they will turn 70.5 on December 30th this year. The only 2 days they can make a QCD in 2022 are December 30th and December 31st, and you better hope they're not Saturday and Sunday. Right? Those are the only 2 days. It cannot happen. So that's the first thing I want to hit on. The second thing is that we talk about the limit of $100,000 per person. A lot of times, individuals say, they get this idea that it's limited to the RMD. It's not. It can always be up to $100,000. You just don't have any more credit than what your RMD is for the RMD. So if your client has a $12,000 RMD, but they decide they want to give $20,000 to the Federation, it's still best to give all $20,000 via their IRA. Because remember, and I get into this argument, if you will, or debate occasionally with individuals, say, well, if they're already itemizing, if it isn't giving charitable stock, isn't giving appreciated stock to charity better? Maybe if they are just like 70.5, but generally speaking, the answer is no. Because if I don't give away that IRA money, at some point, someone else will take it out and they will pay the tax, right? And if I don't give away my appreciated stock at some point, assuming I hold on to it, and it's still appreciated, there'll be a step up in basis. And remember, we're not talking about people with 40, 50 plus year life expectancies on average. You must be 70 and a half or older just to enter the contest, right? That's the earliest, that's the youngest you could possibly be. And again, not that somebody is expected who's 70 and a half to pass away at 71, but you might be willing with an 80-year-old client, an 85-year-old client. Even a 70-year-old actuarially is not projected to have, much more than a 17-year life expectancy, give or take, depending upon age and sex, et cetera. All right, so that's one. The other thing next one I wanted to focus on here, was this, the bottom point here. The QCD amount would have to be entirely deductible if it were made with non-qualified funds. So what does that mean? Well, do you ever have a client or even yourself make a large gift to a charity, right? And the charity sends back, remember our couple with $100,000 that we said they were going to give away? If they gave away $100,000 and they got back a letter in the mail, something like, hey, thanks so much for your $100,000 donation. The tax-deductible value of your gift is actually $999,997, because here is a coffee cup with the name of our charity on it, valued at $3. Well, that doesn't really impact clients when it's an after-tax gift, right? It's a gift of taxable dollars, because the $3 difference in their actual deduction changes the outcome by a matter of pennies, literally, right? Even for those in the highest tax bracket. But if that was supposed to be a QCD, would the entire amount now have been deductible? The answer is no. And so it fails to be treated as a QCD, or it should fail to be treated as a QCD, in which case we've got that $100,000 treated as a regular distribution followed by a regular charitable contribution, right? In our example, that cup, that coffee mug, could have just been a $3,800 cup of coffee. Even Starbucks in New York City is not that expensive, right? So we've got to sometimes have weird conversations with clients and their charities of choice to say something like, hey, we're going to be making a large contribution. Please don't send us your free stuff. It's too expensive, right? It is weird. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question.
So I used to work in the nonprofit development office, so this is all I get. If you are a donor to a nonprofit, you've made that gift, they don't send you a coffee cup or a T-shirt or anything.
Yep.
But 6 months later, they invite you to their gala because you are a donor. Does that impact that?
No. If you get that letter and that matches up 100% to what you gave, you're good. Great question. And for those online who didn't necessarily hear, the question was hey, what happens if you give a large amount? Now, there would be some gray room. The question was, what if you give a large amount and then you get invited to some gala down the road because you're a large donor? I would say that there's a fine line here, right? If it's give this and we will give you 2 tickets to our gala, that will fail. If you have made a large donation and it's free and clear, so to speak, and then down the road the charity says, you know what? We're going to try to get some more money from these people, right? You go to the people who have money if you're a charity. That makes a lot of sense, right? So you invite them to something else, and then you try to, get them to give more, then I think you're on solid footing. Also good strategy by the charity. All right, so the other thing I would point out here is, apparently we're going to point out this. Your CLE Attendance Verification Code. Let me stop here. So if you need to write this down, your CLE Attendance Verification Code. I do believe there's one more of these baked in here somewhere. But this is there if you need to write it down, 061224, 061224. Okay? Anybody need me to keep this up longer? Perfect. All right. So the other thing that's really critical here is that many times this is done correctly. We actually do everything right, and it doesn't end up getting reported correctly on the client's tax return, in which case it's kind of all for naught. Right? There's no special 1099-R, no special coding on a distribution form that lets a CPA or a tax professional know that this was a QCD. So how do we know? There's only one way. The client really, you tell the tax professional, this was a QCD, or this is how much it was. There's nothing connecting the two. Every once in a while, someone says, well, there'll be a $3,000 distribution from the IRA and a $3,000 letter, thanking them from the charity, saying $3,000. Won't the tax, won't the CPA realize that they're connected and ask the client? And I was like, have you ever been in a tax office during tax season? There is zero chance that that is going to get picked up. And zero might be overestimating, right? Zero. The other thing is, what if the client took $10,000 out of their IRA, but only gave $2,000 to charity via the QCD? Their 1099 says $10,000. The letter from the charity says $2,000. There's not even a common number anymore. So we've got to make sure that this gets to the tax professional appropriately, right? Because this is reported just like a rollover is, right? Just like a rollover, how do you know, how does the IRS know you did a rollover? You tell them. That's it. You tell them. Well, the same thing applies here with the QCD. You tell them. The gross distribution would be whatever the amount is. If everything went to the charity, let's say, the taxable amount would be $0, and next to it you'd see the letters QCD for Qualified Charitable Distribution. Now, you don't need to be responsible for that unless you are the tax preparer here, but you do need to make sure that your client gets that information over. It's why I always suggest, if you're an advisor here, one of the most powerful things you can do early in the year is to send a tax letter out to the tax professionals of your shared clients with CPAs, EAs, etc. Send a letter, right? Imagine a letter going to a CPA at the beginning of a year saying, Dear Mary, great to see you last, November. Can't believe another year's in the books. Hey, just want to remind you, we have the following shared client in common. And last year, I want to just make you aware of some things we did that you might want to know for tax filing this year. We did a QCD of this amount. They made contributions to their grandkids' 529 plans in this amount. We took distributions from these 4 accounts. You should be expecting 4 1099-Rs, of which we will send you copies digitally once we have them. In their brokerage account, their taxable account, we sold this investment, which didn't have any basis listed, but we've already tracked it down for you. Here it is. If you have any questions, please, reach out and let me know. What CPA would not go, okay, I'd like to send you all my clients, because I want that letter for every one of my clients. Because in tax season, right, what do you want? Like, if you're a CPA, what can you do as an advisor to get more referrals? Save a CPA time during tax season, right? Get me home one more night to eat dinner with my kids. Give me one more Saturday to watch a kid's soccer game or spend time with my wife or whoever it is, right? But that's the value there. Not having to chase down that information would be incredibly powerful. All right, next issue here is a legal issue, incorrect understanding of creditor and bankruptcy protection rules. And this is particularly important in our climate now, where clients tend to move around more. We have greater geographic or ability to change locations than we ever did before, especially now that people are getting more comfortable with virtual work environments and virtual just about anything. Geography is so much less of a limiting factor than it used to be. And while that's great for clients, it makes our job as planners a little bit more difficult, because so many of the things that we do and implement with clients are based not just on federal law, but are based on state law as well. Right? So many things. And one of them comes down to creditor protection of assets. And in general, I would agree, you're probably not unless you're an asset protection attorney or a bankruptcy attorney, you're probably not working with the right folks for you if you're a wealth manager or a estate planning attorney, if everybody is bankrupt. That's probably not a good demographic to target, a good niche practice you have there. However, there's kind of a nuance here when it comes to retirement accounts, because individuals can actually safeguard vast amounts of wealth inside their retirement accounts. And I see some people taking notes, that's great. Others not, and you're doing things mentally, which is fine. That's how oftentimes I do. But if you're taking notes, let me give you a thought here. I would divide your paper into 2 sides. And on one side, just put a little header, bankruptcy, and on the other side, right, general creditor protection. And we're going to kind of compare and contrast them now because the rules are often confused between the two, hence why it's on our list of 10 common IRA errors, okay? So just make a little T-chart. On one side, we're going to label it bankruptcy, and on the other side, we're going to label it general creditor protection. And now we're going to go through the next few slides using that chart. So on our left side of our chart, where we're talking about bankruptcy, the first thing we're going to put on that chart is our key question. And our key question here is, are we talking about a plan or are we talking about an IRA? That is going to be the distinguishing factor that tells us what the treatment is. Is it a plan or is it an IRA? So that's our key question. That's our first bullet point, if you will, on that side. Now, once we ask that question, presumably we have answered it, right? We know the situation. Oh, it's a traditional IRA. Oh, it's a 401k. Once we know the answer to it, then what are the rules? Well, the rules are as follows. For plans, it is 100% protected. I don't care how much it is. It is 100% protected in bankruptcy. You can have $1 billion in your 401k. If you declare bankruptcy, your $1 billion will be protected. Okay? Now, with IRAs, they are virtually, they have virtual unlimited protection. Not technically, but virtually they have unlimited protection. Why? Well, because as you see here, they have a little bit more than a $1.5 million limit. However, because I'm sure every one of you is saying, but I know people with more than $1.5 million in an IRA. Here's the question. How did they get it there? The answer is almost always they took money from a plan and then moved it to the IRA, right? Unless your client happens to be Peter Thiel, and he has $5 billion now in a Roth IRA, apparently. The client did not get more than $1.5 million plus by making their $6,000 and $7,000 a year IRA contributions. I ran the math before the latest inflation adjustment, and by the way, this is coming out of the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act back in 2005. So this is almost 2 decades old now. Every 3 years, that IRA cap gets inflation adjusted. We just had it earlier this year in April, and another 3 years in April, it will get lifted again. But that cap, again, only applies to the contributions and the earnings. I ran a number, before the recent inflation cap, I ran a calculation. I said, what if from the dawn of IRAs, when they were first created, you started making your maximum contribution every year? And then once catch-up contributions were created, you started maxing those out every single year. Well, if you had done that every single year, you would have had to have like a 21% IRR every year, right? Possible, but highly unlikely that you will run across someone with more than $1.5 million in their IRA because of those annual contributions. So we have 3 bullet points on the left side of our page right now. We have the key question, which was, is it a plan or is it an IRA? We have, if it's a plan, it's unlimited, and we have, if it's an IRA, it's 1.5, but it's limited to the contributions, which also tells us our next bullet point, which is, if plan money is rolled over, the plan protection follows. Okay, now it's really critical here that we understand that this only applies if we're looking at the left side of our page here, which is bankruptcy. Okay, and obviously I'm making the emphasis here because it's going to be different on the other side, right? But in bankruptcy, the protection that the plan has follows over to the IRA. So if your client had $1.5 million in an IRA from their contributions and its earnings, and they took $5 million from a 401k, and now they've got $6.5 million in the IRA, and they declare bankruptcy, all of that money is protected. The last bullet point on our left side here under bankruptcy is going to deal with SEP and simple IRAs. And it's simply, and then I'll take the question. And the SEP and simple IRAs, there's always that kind of amoeba-like quality they have, right? Sometimes they look a little bit more like IRAs, right? Like, hey, if you're 72, you're taking RMDs, whether you're working or not. Sometimes they look a little bit more like well, here, they're plans. So you could have an unlimited amount in a SEP or a simple IRA and declare bankruptcy. Yes, ma'am?
So, let's say you do have someone that has more than 1.5, and there was a rollover from 401k, and they're in RMD status. Are
million and
So just make sure I understand the question. So the question is, they've got some money in a plan, they've got $2 million in IRA that is all from contributions and earnings?
let's say,
So in that case, the excess above the 1.5,
no, and then they roll over their 401k. Now they have 6 million in there and they're taking money out.
gotcha. So the taking money out part doesn't really matter. I mean, you have to avoid fraudulent transfers and conveyances and all that sort of stuff. But the spending of dollars is not really relevant. It's just how did the money get into that account? If it was from a plan, that amount is unlimited. If it was in the IRA and generated in the IRA initially, then that will have the $1.5 million protection. Anything else above that would be available, unless state law gave you an even better deal. So some state laws, like bankruptcy is a nuanced area. It's one of those things where federal and state law kind of have to mesh together. So every state kind of gets to choose its bankruptcy rules. Some will just say, we're going to use the federal laws. Some will say, I'm going to use the state laws that we have here. And some will give you a choice as to the venue you want to have, whether you want a federal bankruptcy or you want a state law bankruptcy. That said, the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act says, no matter what, in a worst case scenario, you, Mr. State, I don't know, somehow states are now Mr., but you, Mr. or Mrs. State, you will not be able to give a minimum exemption that is less than $1.5 million. It's kind of like, that's the minimum. You can do whatever you want above and beyond that, but you cannot have it less than that federal limit that we've set. And this, by the way, this law, this sounds great, and it is for retirement accounts from a protection standpoint, but this law is actually largely intended to make it easier for creditors to get that money. In fact, many of you are very familiar with this law, may not realize that this is actually the same law that makes it almost impossible, to get out of student bankruptcy, to get out of student debt, I should say. Right? This is the law that said you can't declare bankruptcy generally and get out of your student debt. Did I answer your question, or? We'll chat after. Yeah, sure. Yes, ma'am.
So if you roll over multiple 401ks.
Okay. Yep.
Does that hinder the uncapped protection?
No. No. And theoretically, you could take IRA money and move it into a plan and have unlimited protection, but you couldn't do it like, oh crud, I just got into a car accident, let me do that now, right? Because that would be a fraudulent transfer. But if you just did it in general, that would work. All right, so we've now covered our left side of our column, and we're going to now just go to the right side, and we're going to do the equivalent on the right side. We're going to go down and do what is an equal thing to put opposite. Remember, left side, we had our key question, plan or IRA. Plan's unlimited, IRA is 1.5. Plan protection follows to the IRA, and SEP and Simple's our plans. That was our left side. On our right side, our key question now becomes, not is it a plan or an IRA, is it an ERISA protected plan? Which is the critical element here. Is it an ERISA plan? And most of the time, it's pretty obvious, right? If your client works for, let's say, Xerox, and they have a Xerox 401k, it is a ERISA covered plan. But it's not always so clear. For instance, solo 401ks are not really ERISA plans, at least not for this purpose, right? Which makes sense, right? What does the E in ERISA stand for? Employee. And if you are a solo 401k, what don't you have? You have no employees. So you have no ERISA federal creditor protection. So sometimes it's not as obvious, but most of the time it's pretty clear. Once we've asked our key question, right, so we compared that, key question left, plan or IRA, key question right, ERISA plan or not. If it's not, so that could be a solo 401k, it could be a non-ERISA type of plan, it could be an IRA. If it's a not column, well, then it's going to default to state law. If it's an ERISA plan, we should all know that basically unless you're an ex-spouse or the IRS, you are probably not getting that money, right? ERISA's anti-alienation provision is second to none. The creditor protection and asset protection there is pretty well bulletproof. Now, in New York, the IRA protection that is given is roughly equivalent. So if your clients move assets from a 401k to an IRA here in New York, the creditor protection that individuals receive here is pretty darn good. It's pretty close. But that is not the case everywhere. For instance, Maine and California come to mind as like key states where their laws stink in this regard, right? In California, effectively, and I'm putting this in very lay terms, but effectively, California will protect the amount of money in the IRA in general creditor issues that your client needs to live on in retirement. Now, do you think the amount that your client needs to live on by the court's definition might be slightly different than maybe what your client wants to live on, right? Or what they think they need? I mean, these are the types of things that we have to look at. So where your client lives today, but also where they may live in the future, can impact that, right? And sometimes it may just be, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you're going to California, you've got a really large retirement account. I know you're being there to move with your grandkids. I'm not trying to stop you, but you might up your umbrella coverage from $1 million to $5 million. Pay a couple extra $100 for the umbrella coverage because your IRA won't have the same protection, right? Those sorts of things, you might have conversations like that. All right, let's keep moving on. Now, if you take money from a plan to an IRA, or go the opposite way, from an IRA up to a plan, the protection does not follow. Right? So once again, we're comparing and contrasting on the other side. We said in bankruptcy, the protection follows. If a general creditor situation arises, which is simply, I'm being sued, but I'm not declaring bankruptcy, right? It's any other time you're being sued other than when you're declaring bankruptcy, the protection does not follow. Then we get to Lampkins v. Golden. This is akin to our SEPs and Simples plans. Well, are SEPs and Simples, are they IRAs here because they're not really ERISA plans? In most places, the answer appears to be yes. However, there is one district court in the Lampkins v. Golden decision where they have ruled the worst possible outcome. They have ruled that SEPs and Simples get no creditor protection. Not federal, not state, squadoosh, nothing. Now why? Because somebody's going to ask, how could they rule that? Well, effectively what they said was, these aren't ERISA-covered plans in that the anti-alienation provision of ERISA doesn't apply to them. However, there is applicable aspects of ERISA with respect. Like for instance, I can't say, you know what, I'm going to create a SEP for me. My employees, nothing for you, right? Because there are anti-discrimination provisions that apply. Those come from ERISA. Well, that court came to the decision that because the federal government wrote in these protections for workers in ERISA for, let's say, SEP and Simples, but didn't give them the same anti-alienation provision as ERISA, even though it was silent, it didn't say they don't get it, the fact that in the federal law, it covered other things, but not those, the district court there said, the circuit court there said, it must be because Congress intended it that way. And where federal and state law conflict, the supremacy clause of the Constitution says we've got to go with federal law. And so there, they determined that they have no creditor protection at all. It's one jurisdiction, one circuit, but here's what I would do if I had a client with a decent-sized SEP or simple IRA. Before they had a creditor issue, I would just roll it to an IRA. Your cost of doing so is $0, and you're giving yourself better enhanced creditor protection. So that would be a big takeaway for me here, is if you run across someone with a SEP or a simple IRA that has sufficient dollars in it, or significant dollars to that client, I would move it. The SEP you can move anytime. The simple you can move after 2 years from the first date contributions went in there. And before that, it's probably not going to be that sizable anyway, right? But you might as well, if you've got a decent size account, move it. And you know what? You have a conversation with the client. You say, you know what? I was going through one of my annual education updates, and I learned about this case. It's probably no big deal, but what client is not going to be like, wow, thank you, that's a great idea, right? It'd be a good conversation to highlight the fact that you continue to go to programs like this. All right, CLE Verification Code, second one here, 101-829, 101-829. Somebody in the back, bingo. All right. All right, next item here, keeping after-tax dollars in a plan for too long. Quite simply put, many people are familiar with the IRA Pro Router Rule. Yes?
Same question on solo 401ks. Would you roll those? Keep what protection?
So I would keep those. There's no reason, I would say, to think that they wouldn't be covered under state law for the time being. I mean, you could, and you could just say, who knows, but we don't have that same sort of precedent to follow. Good question. Yeah. All right, so item number 3, failing to keep, or rather I should say, keeping after-tax dollars in a plan for too long. If you have clients with after-tax dollars in a plan, you should try to exit those dollars from the plan as quickly as practicable, right? As quickly as practicable. Now, many of us are familiar with after-tax dollars in an IRA, right? The quote-unquote backdoor IRA. And the difference between an IRA and a plan is that with an IRA, we're almost always subject to this pro rata rule, right? Which effectively says if I have a client who has $95,000 of pre-tax money in one IRA, and then I make another $5,000 non-deductible contribution to a separate IRA at a separate financial institution located in a separate state, and then I turn around and say, convert that $5,000, it's not a tax-free conversion because I can't convert that $5,000. The IRS says you have one giant $100,000 IRA of which 5% is after tax, so 5% of that $5,000 conversion will be tax-free, $250 in this case. The other $4,750 will be taxable. And it's not like the other after-tax money is gone, but it's effectively like held hostage in the traditional IRA, right, until you take distributions in the future. Certainly not the tax-free conversion that the client wants. And even worse, if I took, let's say, the $100,000 out of the IRA, or even the $5,000, I can't break apart the after-tax dollars and the pre-tax dollars. They are effectively stuck together forever, till death do them part, right? So if I were to take the $100,000 out and I said, send $5,000 to my Roth and send the other $95,000 to my traditional, well, 5% of the $5,000 that goes to the Roth will be after tax. The other 95% will be taxable. And if I go to the Roth, or the traditional, the same thing. I'll have the same 5 and 95% ratio. With a plan, when we have after-tax dollars in the plan, the rules for the distribution side are relatively similar. I still have to take a pro rata distribution. However, the difference is I can break apart the pre- and post-tax dollars of the distribution from the plan and send them to separate destinations. And the reason that matters, and the reason why we want to do this as soon as practicable, like if you see a client who has after-tax dollars in their 401k, why we want to say, let's get these out, is every day we let those dollars sit in the traditional side of the plan. Just like the growth on a non-deductible IRA contribution in a traditional IRA is taxable, right? The earnings are taxable. So too is the growth on after-tax 401k dollars, for instance, sitting in the pre-tax side of the 401k. But if I were able to convert those dollars and put them in the Roth, well, now I take those dollars and they're all going to grow tax-free forever. The challenge, and again, the difference between the IRA and the plan is that if I have IRA money that is pre-tax, I have to drag along and pay some tax to get the after-tax dollars growing tax-free. So in my example, for instance, the 5 and the 95, if I want to convert the 5 and get that 5,000 growing tax-free, I've got to pay tax on $95,000 to get it there because I can't just carve out the 5. But with a plan, I can take that $100,000 distribution and send 5 to a Roth and send 95 to a traditional, and the cost of my conversion for the after-tax dollars is 0. and I just took those dollars and made every single dollar of interest, dividends, and capital gains on that tax-free from being taxable. Effectively, I went from one pocket of my pants where everything is taxable to a tax-free pocket at a cost to the client of $0. Right? Why would we not do that? And effectively, this is all because of IRS Notice 2014-54. This came out almost a decade ago or so, and yet still commonly run across individuals with significant after-tax balances in their plans that have not converted these. Now, many of you have probably heard, actually just by a quick show of hands so I get a sense of the room, how many are familiar with the concept of the Backdoor Roth IRA? All right, great. Probably 80, 90% of hands going up. Effectively, for those maybe who are not financial advisors or haven't heard this before, this is effectively the idea where if you're a high income earner and you can't put money directly into a Roth IRA because you're over the income limits, you first make a contribution, generally it's going to be non-deductible, to a traditional IRA which doesn't have the same income limits on contributions, and then you turn around and make a conversion of those dollars because there are no income limits on the conversion. I hesitate to use the word step here, but effectively you're doing in two steps what you can't do in one, but the IRS has effectively said this is not a step transaction, don't worry about it. So, if some is good, more is better. And that is effectively the quote-unquote mega backdoor Roth. This is the planned version of the backdoor Roth IRA. So imagine that, or not imagine, but like this year, we've got a $61,000 maximum limit on go to a defined contribution plan, right? Now, there's another limit on the salary deferrals, but let's just say your client has put in $21,000 of salary deferrals this year. And your client's plan matches them some dollars, maybe there's some profit sharing, and let's imagine that the company that your client works for put in another 10. So the 10 plus the 21 is $31,000. That $31,000 and $61,000, there's a difference there, right, of $30,000. If the plan allows after-tax contributions, and the plan has to allow this, the client, if they have the income, the wages to do this, they can put $30,000 of their compensation into the plan as an after-tax contribution. That's how after-tax dollars get in there. The plan has to allow, the client has to have the compensation, and then they can fill up whatever is left in their, in this case, this year's $61,000 limit. That's a typo. That should be $61,000 for 2022, sorry. $61,000 simply because then we now have that. Now, once the money is inside the plan, right, once the money is inside the plan, then we can turn around and we can do a Roth conversion on it. Now, a couple of common things here. First off, your ideal targets for this type of planning is a sole proprietor, right, or someone who can have a solo 401k for a few reasons. First, if their plan doesn't allow after-tax contributions, you can make it because they're the owner. They can just amend the plan. If the rules aren't what they want, change the rules, right? The other reason, and the more relevant one here, is that you don't have to worry about testing, okay? Whereas many of us, if we have clients with a number of employees and our client wants to put a good chunk of their salary away, we end up putting money into, let's say, a safe harbor plan, right? We'll do that. Well, that allows us to put our deferrals in to the maximum amount, but you cannot safe harbor your way out of the ACP test. That test always has to be done. But of course, if you're a sole proprietor, there's no testing because it's just you. So that's your ideal. Your next kind of target would be a small business owner because they at least have the ability to amend the plan, right, if it doesn't allow it, and hopefully their contributions will pass testing. If you're not sure whether this makes sense, ask the administrator, hey, based on what people put in last year, how much in after-tax contributions would the business owner have been able to put away, right? How much could they have done? And then finally, sometimes you get big companies, right, where, a Xerox, for instance, I don't know if they have after-tax dollars in their plan, maybe someone here knows. They do? Okay, someone says they do. I don't know if that's true or not, but We'll take your word for it. And you would be able to, to use this. Now, again, the longer you let those after-tax dollars sit in the traditional side of the plan, the longer they're growing taxable. Right? If you put in $30,000 of after-tax and the market goes up 10% this year, and you left it there the whole year, well, that's $3,000 that at some point your client will pay tax on. If you had kind of converted at the beginning of the year, right after the 30 went in, that $3,000 would have accumulated in the Roth side, effectively tax-free. So a few thoughts here. First, a common question or a common hand goes up with the common, a hand usually goes up with the following common question. Jeff, my client is only 40. They love the company they work for. They're probably going to die at that company. They're never leaving. They can't touch their plan money for the next 19 and a half years at a minimum because they're not 59 and a half. That is generally true. But there is an exception in the law that allows access to plan money for after-tax dollars and their earnings. If the plan allows, you can access those dollars at any time. So I could have a 40-year-old, executive or solo practitioner or good business owner. A lot of times, I'll be honest, this is one of those slides where people come up after the program and say, so can I do this for myself? Right? A lot of times, this is one of those where I end up in a lot of side conversations after. Yeah, if you're a sole accountant, sole financial advisor, and you've got this thing going, and you could have other people in your office too. Again, it's just easier when it's solo. You could do this. You could fill that up. You could turn around, and even if you're young, you can have access to those. When I say young, I'm using the tax code definition of below 59 and a half here. You can have access to those dollars and convert them. And now, as soon as you do, all that money is growing tax-free forever. Now, here's the thing. How much money do we save the client in taxes the year we do this? 0. That's correct. Somebody said 0. That's right, because I'm taking $30,000 that would have been in a brokerage account, right? Just taxable dollars growing, and I made an after-tax contribution, no tax break. But how much, what's the value of not paying taxes on the growth of $30,000 for the next 40, 50 years of the client's life? Times however many years we can do this, right? If we did this for a 40-year-old and we did this for 20 years, that's $600,000 that's growing tax-free at a cost of $0 to the client. So effectively, again, the sooner we can do this, the better. But if you recall, I said as soon as practicable. And so I'll leave you with one final point here. If it's a sole proprietor, I'm probably doing this as soon as the dollars go in. If I have a small business owner and I'm not entirely sure how much they'll be able to keep in because of testing, I'm going to wait until the testing occurs the following year. It's as soon as practicable. It's not as soon as possible. It's as soon as practicable. Because if I roll those dollars out to a Roth IRA first, and then the plan comes back and tells me the client put in too much money, it is a nightmare of a time to get the money back from the Roth into the plan, from the plan back to the client. You could see where that would be challenging, and very quickly the headache makes it not worth it. All right, mistake number 4, failing to understand the 99% rule. On the estate planning side for IRAs, we have a possible 3 choices here for surviving spouses. And this is one of those things, like bankruptcy, hopefully you run across maybe once in your whole time doing practice, right? Maybe you run across it more, but hopefully not. This is something that every one of us probably has to deal with every single year. A spouse dying and the surviving spouse inheriting that individual's IRA, 401k, etc. So let's take a few moments to discuss what are the possibilities and generally what should we do. Well, the first one here is we remain a beneficiary of the inherited IRA. That's possibility number 1. I set up a properly titled inherited IRA. Possibility number 2 is I do a spousal rollover. I take the deceased person's IRA and I move it into my own. And finally, number 3 is I just pretend that I am the dead person. Those are our 3 choices. Now, 2 and 3, from a tax code perspective, are essentially the same. Right? Either way, we're going to treat it as though it was the surviving spouse's own account the entire time. So from a tax perspective, and I know someone's going to say, well, why does that exist? Think of this more of like Sometimes you better be off continuing an existing annuity or something like that, right, where you can just pretend that you're that person. But from a tax code perspective, 2 and 3 are the same. So let's make our life simple here and boil it down to, should I be a beneficiary or should I do a rollover? Now, why would someone want to set up an inherited IRA and remain a beneficiary? Well, we could start out with the primary reason here. It's not the only reason, as we will soon discover, but the primary reason is you want to access the money in the IRA or the 401k without a 10% penalty. If it's a young spouse, again, tax code definition here, under 59 and a half, if you are young, then if you move that money into your own name, then if you take a distribution prior to 59 and a half, it's going to be as though it was yours. It'll be subject to not only tax, but a 10% penalty. By contrast, right, if I set up an inherited IRA, I'm a beneficiary, just like anybody else. And just as a 2-year-old or a 200-year-old would not pay a penalty if they were a beneficiary, so too would a surviving spouse. They just set up the inherited IRA. They look like any other beneficiary from a penalty perspective. But they also get some special rules. And those special rules sort of make this a no-brainer for most young spouses. For instance, if you ask a young spouse who's done a spousal rollover, let's say you run across a 50-year-old spouse, and you say, well, why did you do a spousal rollover? Why didn't you set up the inherited IRA? Weren't you worried about maybe needing those dollars? The number one answer, by far the most common answer you will get, is wrong. The number one answer you will get is, I didn't want to have to take RMDs. And that is decidedly not an issue for most surviving spouses who set up inherited IRAs. A surviving spouse who sets up an inherited IRA does not have to take RMDs from the inherited IRA account until the decedent would have needed to take RMDs. Right? That is, that means that as long as they're even remotely close in age, we're talking like 12 and a half years, if they're not more than that apart, there's never a time where the surviving spouse with the inherited IRA is in a position where they have to take an RMD. Because once the survivor reaches 59 and a half themselves, they can always do a spousal rollover. Right? There's no deadline to do it, but it is irrevocable. Right? There's no deadline to do it. So I'll give you an example. I'm 39 this year. My wife later this year will be 37. If something happens to me right now, my wife, my financial advisor, will know unequivocally that my wife is to set up an inherited IRA, and she will leave it that way for the next 22 and a half years until she turns 59 and a half. That whole time, if she needs it, and hopefully she doesn't because there's enough life insurance and other assets, but if she did, she has full flexibility to go into that account. And it costs her nothing to do it, because when she would be 59 and a half in 22 and a half years, I would only be 61, 62. I would not yet reach 72. So there would never be a time when she would be forced to take an RMD. It's all the benefits of access with none of the challenges of taking RMDs, or none of the downside of adding that income. You only add it if you want it. And what you want to really avoid is becoming or finding yourself in a position like Charlotte G. Charlotte G is probably not a name many of you or any of you have heard of, but she is a young woman, or was a young woman, who went to tax court. Because after she inherited $2 million from her husband, she didn't work with a professional like one of you who said, let's set up an inherited IRA. She did a spousal rollover. And then she took $997,000 plus out of her IRA to go buy a condo. And the IRS hit her with the tax bill on the $1 million and a $100,000 penalty. Now, she went to tax court and argued. She said, but what are you doing? I inherited this. This is an inherited IRA. I'm a beneficiary. I'm not supposed to pay a penalty. And the IRS, the tax court agreed with the IRS. They said, no, no, no. Mrs. G, you were a beneficiary. The moment you moved those dollars into your own account, it was treated as though they were in there from day one, and you were the individual who was responsible for making those decisions, and she lost. We want to avoid that. And I can tell you I've seen so many of these issues over the years, so many that I just got so frustrated, I said, let me just make this as simple as possible. So I came up with what I call my 99% rule. The 99% rule says this: 99% of the time, if your surviving spouse is under 59.5, you should be setting up the inherited IRA. It's a no-brainer. Zero downside, only upside. There is no reason not to do it 99% of the time. And 99% of the time, if your surviving spouse is over 59.5, you're going to do a spousal rollover. That's it. Now, of course, I know if I leave it here, someone is going to raise their hands and say, okay, Jeff, that's great, but what's the 1%? Right? What are the exceptions to that rule? And I don't know whether it's really 1%, maybe it's 2, 3, but it's the minority of the time, right? The overwhelming minority of the time. Two situations. I'm going to give you names so that they stick in your head. Instead of scenario 1 and scenario 2, I'm going to give you names for them. First one is called, I will call the Modern Family Conundrum. Anybody remember that show from TV, right? Great show, right? Ed O'Neill from Married with Children, right? He was Al Bundy. He's married to Sofia Vergara on the show. Now, they're not married in real life, but let's just pretend they were. And now let's imagine that Ed O'Neill dies. Ed O'Neill this year, I think he's like 76, something like that. Let's say he dies and he left his IRA to Sophia, who's this year maybe 48-ish or something like that. So 99% of the time, we would say, hey, she's a young spouse under 59.5. It's a no-brainer. Set up the inherited IRA. But here's one of those odd scenarios where the age gap is so significant that it's not a no-brainer anymore. It's not don't do it. It's just not a no-brainer. It's not automatic reflex. It's now a decision of what's more important to you, Mr. or Mrs. surviving spouse. Would you rather have penalty-free access at a cost of having RMDs each year because your deceased spouse is already over 72, or do you have enough money that you're very confident you will never need these dollars, in which case we can do a spousal rollover. You can avoid RMDs for the next 10, 20, whatever years. But if you need this money before you're 59.5, you're going to have a penalty, right? It becomes a weighing decision, right? Which of these is more important? And that's a client-by-client decision. Now, having said all that, in most cases, I'd probably still set up the inherited IRA, because if the surviving spouse is that young, how big is the RMD, right? Very small. So I would usually do it just as insurance, right, in case I need the money. All right, the next scenario here, I'm going to give you another wacky name. We're going to call this one the reverse Hugh Hefner. Now, you may remember that guy. I think he was like 140 when he died. And at the time, I think he was married to someone who was like 18. So I said, we're going to call this the reverse Hugh Hefner, right? Well, he died in life, but let's say it was the reverse. She died. Now, 99% of the time, if that happened and your client was over 59.5, as he was, you'd say, we do the spousal rollover. But what if your client is like Hugh and doesn't need the money? If he does a spousal rollover, when does he have to start taking RMDs? Next year, right? As soon as he puts that money in his account. But if he sets up an inherited IRA, when does he need to start taking RMDs? When she would be 72. Yeah, he'll be 260 by then, right? So, again, an exaggerated example to make the point, you probably won't have too many 18-year-old clients dying, leaving 80-year-olds money, but you might have a 60-year-old spouse who dies and leaves money to a 65-year-old spouse. You want to buy 5 more years of tax deferral for free? You want 5 more years of more efficient Roth conversions because you don't first have to take an RMD? What's your downside for doing so? Nothing. Why not give clients the option? So a younger spouse dies, leaves it to an older spouse, provided the younger spouse wasn't already 72, right? In which case it doesn't matter, right? If the younger spouse was under 72 and dies, setting up the inherited IRA makes sense. All right. Mistake number 5, I'm going to move through a little bit more quickly. I'm simply going to say, don't ignore these things. QLACs. By quick show of hands here, how many know what I'm talking about when I say QLAC? All right, we went from 80% to 8%. So QLAC is a qualifying longevity, I'm going to say the word, annuity contract. Now, I know for some of you in here, the minute I just said annuity, inside you went, right, like that. Now, I am a CPA. I'm a chief planning officer for a fee-only firm. I am like your poster child for an individual who is supposed to hate annuities. The reality is there is a ton of academic support and academic evidence to support things like QLACs, longevity annuities. I'm not tarnishing, I'm not saying anything bad about others. All I'm saying is these in particular have a lot of peer-reviewed academic support behind them. The idea that annuitizing a portion of your savings can help minimize longevity risk, and on top of that, can help you to spend more during your lifetime. Now that's kind of counterintuitive, right? The idea of, well, I could spend more during my lifetime. But effectively, and why is it in IRAs here? Well, QLACs are in our IRA discussion because back in 2014, the Treasury came up with these regulations that said, if you invest in a QLAC, we will let you take this money and we will carve it out from your required minimum distribution. You won't have any RMDs on this, but you won't have to start taking money from these contracts until you're 85. So the fair market value can be excluded from a client's RMD calculation, even though they don't have to start taking money at 85, until 85. Well, here's the thing. Imagine if I could guarantee that as long as the client reaches age 85, that they would have a new income source that would kick on. And hypothetically, every client's different, but hypothetically, let's say that new income source, if they hit 85, plus whatever Social Security they had, would be enough that as long as they lived, they wouldn't run out of money, right? They'd have income every year. Then what I've really done is solve the issue that retirement is an unknown, right? Because effectively, I can plan that you die at 85. I might want a little buffer there, right? But I effectively can allow you to spend all that money. One of the best analogies I've ever heard to describe these types of things came from Michael Finca, who's from the American College. And he basically used the analogy like this. Imagine you invited 50 people to a birthday party, and you wanted to make sure that each of them got a piece of cake, but you lost all the RSVPs, right? And so now you don't know how many people are coming, and you start to cut the cake as the first person arrives. Well, how big of a slice do you cut? Because you might have 50 guests, but maybe you only have 40. Maybe you only have 30. If you cut the cake so small, you might end up with a huge amount of that cake left over because you didn't need it, but you didn't know that. So you have to cut small slices in the beginning. I think it's a kind of a neat analogy, right? And it really explains the idea that if we don't have some sort of reserve for later on, we're forced to kind of take smaller amounts because we have to worry about what if I live to 95? Anyway, so I will just say, don't overlook these things. There's some tax benefits here that help pay for the cost. Again, I'm not an annuity salesperson. I'm not a wholesaler. I get no benefit for saying this other than I believe in academic research, and there's a lot of it here. All right. Next, mistake number 6, failing to review see-through trusts after the Secure Act. You know, the Secure Act had an incredibly profound impact on estate planning for IRAs. But many of us have not yet had conversations with our clients, or the conversations with our clients that we really need to have regarding how this will impact them, and more particularly, their heirs. Right? And for good reason. Because if you think about it, remember, this was passed in December, the end of December in 2020. Right? We had 11 days, I think, to begin preparing clients between passage and implementation of this law. I got it. Now, the next issue was that just a few weeks after this happened, the world shut down. Right? Like, let's go back in time and remember where we were, you know, and how far we've come and how far we still have to go. But the world shut down. Clients were not worried about, what happens to my IRA when I die? They were worried, I don't want to die. Right? Like, that was what was on people's minds at the time, including many of our own. So Whereas normally, a major impact to a client 2+ years later like this, we would have had these conversations. Many to date still have not. And I would encourage you to do so. And this area in particular, where we have trusts as a beneficiary, is probably one of those where you can accelerate to the top of the list because there are so many critical discussions that come out of the Secure Act. Now, we don't have time to go through a full review of trusts. We could literally spend an entire day doing that, and sometimes I do. But here, for our purposes today, let's just remember that in general, a trust is not a living, breathing person, doesn't get to be a designated beneficiary. But the tax rules say if we have a see-through trust, and if it follows 4 provisions, namely it's valid under state law, the beneficiaries are irrevocable upon death, the trust is irrevocable on death, the beneficiaries are identifiable, and a copy of the trust or a certified list of beneficiaries gets to the custodian in time, then we can treat the individuals in the trust, the applicable beneficiaries, as though they were named directly on the beneficiary form. In essence, the trust will get designated beneficiary status. Well, remember, after the Secure Act, the group of designated beneficiaries that we used to have is split into 2, right? What the Secure Act really did was it bifurcated our old group of designated beneficiaries. It split them into 2 and said you have non-eligible but still designated beneficiaries and eligible designated beneficiaries. The non-eligible designated beneficiaries are those who are subject to the 10-year rule, effectively the default going forward. Then we have eligible designated beneficiaries who are still able to stretch, but it's a relatively narrow group. It's only surviving spouses, those who are disabled, individuals who are chronically ill, a beneficiary who is not younger than 10 years than the decedent, and minor children. That's it. Those are our 5 groups of eligible designated beneficiaries. And what complicates our matters even further is that in the past we had trusts. Then we had, is it a see-through trust, yes or no? Then we said, okay, if it's a see-through trust, it's either a conduit trust or a discretionary trust, and different rules applied. Well, now what we have to do is we have to overlay that with the eligible and non-eligible designated beneficiary rules. And effectively what you get is a 2x2 grid where you can have a conduit trust that is treated as an eligible designated beneficiary and can stretch. You can have a conduit trust subject to the 10-year rule. You can have a discretionary trust that can stretch. It's a little bit more rare, but you can have it. And then you can have a discretionary trust that is subject to the 10-year rule. That complicates our lives. And each one of those boxes, if you will, has very specific consequences for our clients. In fact, I'll give you a little bit of a preview, if you will. If you have a conduit trust that's subject to the 10-year rule, the best case scenario is it's a complete disaster. That is the best case. There's a worst case. We'll cover that too. But that's the best case. It's a complete disaster. All right. So with that as a setup, let's start breaking down this 2x2 grid. And let's start with conduit trusts. Okay. Now, some of you are wondering, how do I know if it's a conduit trust or not? A conduit trust is a conduit trust if the trust language requires whatever comes into the trust each year goes out to the trust beneficiaries. There's no choice on the part of the trustee, right? Whatever comes in has to go right out. In essence, you might say the trust is merely serving as a conduit for those distributions, right? Now, it is not, just to be clear, it's not a trust where the trustee says, oh, I've got my choice and I will pass this out this year. That's still not a conduit trust. The conduit trust says it has to get passed out. Well, if you have a conduit trust where the income beneficiary, and one of the unique things about a conduit trust is that With a discretionary trust, I have to look at all the beneficiaries generally, like all the current and potential future beneficiaries. With a conduit trust, I generally only have to look at who's getting the money today to determine the distribution schedule. If I have a conduit trust with one eligible designated beneficiary, this trust goes to my minor child. The beneficiary of this trust is my surviving spouse. The beneficiary of this trust is my brother, who's 7 years younger. If there's one individual, it is clear the conduit trust will still be able to stretch. We're good. No immediate concern for action here. Doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it with the client, but it's not a critical issue that's rising to the top of our pile. Now, if the conduit trust has 2 income beneficiaries, it is not entirely clear how that will work. Now, normally you would say, but Jeff, wouldn't we just take the older age and stretch distributions over that? Like, hey, I leave this to my 2 siblings, my brother who's 5 years younger and my sister who's 8 years younger. Well, why wouldn't we just stretch using the brother's 5 years younger life? I think that's where we will get. But it's not entirely clear because under the rules, a minor child is an eligible designated beneficiary. But once they are no longer a minor, then they switch to the 10-year rule. So imagine a trust like this. I say I leave it to my second spouse, my wife right now, 50%, and I leave the other 50% to my 10-year-old child. Well, to start, my surviving spouse is going to be the much older life expectancy and force distributions quicker. But what happens when my child reaches the age of majority? All of a sudden, now, 10 years. But I started using her life, and now I'm switching, measuring. I've never done that before. Not clear. So, if you have a trust with multiple eligible designated beneficiaries, and you want to ensure that they can all stretch, the best thing to do would be effectively photocopy the trust, make 2 trusts, 1 for each beneficiary. Right? That is the safest thing you can do today. All right, let's move on to say we know that there is at least one non-eligible designated beneficiary of the conduit trust. Now we have a 10-year rule and a conduit trust, and I alluded to this before. Your best case is it's a total disaster show. Here's the thing. How many would, big show of hands, how many would go through the time and expense and effort of creating a trust to protect the beneficiary for only 10 years? No takers, huh? So nobody in here should have a client with a conduit trust where it's subject to the 10-year rule. Because if we have that situation, right, let's think about it this way. The conduit trust says, or rather the IRA rules say, if it's in the inherited IRA, well, you're subject to the 10-year rule. It has to go from the inherited IRA out into to the beneficiary, which is the trust, by the end of the 10th year, right? And the conduit trust, because it's a conduit trust, it's what makes it a conduit trust, says if it comes in, it must go out, which means by the end of the 10th year, none of those retirement dollars can be protected by the trust anymore. It is a failed trust after just 10 years. And you all just agreed we would never do that. We would never go through that time and expense. Right? And that's the best case, is that over the 10 years, the trustee does this. Right? You know, so if you say that's the best case, it's an unmitigated disaster, or it's a disaster. What's your worst case? A total unmitigated disaster. Right? Imagine a trust that was drafted in the past to force the stretch, or a trust that said, I want the stretch unless there's a specific health event or education need or some sort of specific reason that didn't happen in the 10 years. Then what you're really saying is, hey, that pile of money that I didn't feel comfortable giving to that person, let it grow for another 10 years, maybe double, right? Rule of 72, if it does 7% each year over 10 years, let the million become 2 million, and then in one fell swoop, when there's a required minimum distribution, when everything has to come out in the 10th year, let's give it all to that person in one tax year. That's your total, complete, unmitigated disaster. So a 10-year rule conduit trust is something we must address immediately. Now, a discretionary trust could solve the issue of uselessness after 10 years. However, even that requires more discussion. Because in the past, let's say I was leaving it to 25-year-old children or grandchildren. Oh, all right, I have $1 million. They're going to take out, it's going to go, let's say, 60 years. They're going to take out $20,000, something like that a year. It's going to be split amongst 2 kids. No big deal, right? Like I'm okay if they get some of those dollars. And even if they're held in trust, no big deal. But now, if I have only 10 years for most discretionary trusts, well, if I only have 10 years, even a modest size IRA, if I'm holding those dollars inside the trust, is going to produce distributions north of $13,500, which is where the trust gets to the highest tax bracket, right? So at some point, some of your clients are going to say, I wanted a trust for extra protection, but now that I think about it and I see that between New York's taxes and the federal taxes, half of it's going to go to taxes right away. I think I'd rather my child maybe blow it on a Ferrari than Uncle Sam blow it on a tank. And I only say that half in jest, right? Effectively, using a trust is a balancing act between cost and complexity and the goal to minimize them, and control, right? And for each client, it's just one of those like old scales of justice. Some clients will say, I have a special needs child. I don't care how much it costs in taxes. If I leave it to them, it is all going to go away. So even 50 cents is better than 0 cents. Control outweighs. The client who said, I don't really like my daughter's boyfriend, but I think I'll take my chances if I know 50% is going to go right to taxes each year. These are just discussion points with clients that we should be having. Very few discretionary trusts will be able to stretch going forward. It will generally be only for special needs beneficiaries, what is called under the law an applicable multi-beneficiary trust. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
The person that's the beneficiary is no longer a minor. Because of the Secure Act, does that switch over to the 10-year rule, or is it grandfathered?
Good question. So the question is, effectively, someone died 15 years ago and has a trust. It's being stretched over an individual's life expectancy. They should be good to continue stretching until that beneficiary dies in the trust, at which point it'll flip to the 10-year rule. Now, that answer is based on proposed regulations, not finalized yet, but I suspect that will be the final as well. Good question. All right, now we're going to move on to RMD errors, and I'm going to ask all of you to do me a favor. Don't look forward in your manuals or in your documents. Don't look forward, because I'm going to ask you a question. And hopefully you haven't looked at this yet. Now, before I ask you the question, I'll give you a little bit of backstory here. You heard in the intro that I created a program called Savvy IRA Planning years ago for a company called Horse's Mouth. And when I did it, they had 2 programs in existence already, a Medicare program and a Social Security program. And I went to them, I said, you guys really need an IRA program to kind of complement your suite. And they said, but Jeff, don't advisors and folks, don't they get like really good education in that area? I mean, Medicare and Social Security is kind of like supplementary to what they do, but they deal with IRAs every day. So to settle the debate, if you will, we gave advisors a quiz. And this was a very statistically significant sample of advisors. And we gave 7 questions, multiple choice. And what we found was pretty horrifying, not to mince words. More than half of advisors got 6 out of 7 questions wrong. And on 3 of the questions, advisors scored so statistically poorly that had I given my 3-year-old at home a crayon and blindfolded him and put 4 answers in front of him and said, hey, buddy, circle one, he would have scored statistically higher. One of those dealt with RMD aggregation. We gave advisors a question. There were 4 multiple choice answers, as you can see here, 18% got it correct. If we blindfolded them and had them take the test, 25% should have been the answer. Like, should have at least done 25%. If we didn't know anything, we actually did worse as an industry trying to get the answer correct. So I have since, in about, 200 programs similar to this, asked a similar question live. We've never even gotten a third of the room to get it correct. But today's the day. Today is the day. It's going to happen. All right. So here's the deal. Client comes to you and says, hey, I heard you are the greatest CPA, financial advisor, estate planning attorney, pick your area of practice. You are going to be my professional. I'm going to be the world's greatest client. I won't complain about your fees. I'll pay whatever you want. I will listen to everything of advice you say. All you have to do to get me to be your client is to answer this one question. How many distributions do I have to take? Because I'm 73 this year, and last year I turned 72, and I've got these 6 accounts. And I had to call up each of these 6 institutions last year to process my distribution, and what a nightmare. It was such a pain in the neck. Now, let me preface by saying you can't cheat. You can't roll everything into one IRA and then tell me take one RMD. You can't. There's no still working exception. I'm not trying to trick anybody here. But here's what the client says. They say, yeah, I just want to take like one distribution. Can I do that? Can I just total these up from my accounts? And you ask for a little bit more background, and the client goes on to tell you that they have $6 million, $1 million in each account. They've got $1 million each in 2 IRAs. So they have 2 IRA accounts. They have 2 401k accounts, and they have 2 403b accounts. And all the client wants to know is, how many of these accounts do I really, can I just call up, and like this one account over here, the interest rate is not very good. I'd just like to take my RMD from that one account. Can I do that? Or do I have to call up, like I did last year, all 6 of these places to do this? How many distributions do I have to take? Now, we gave, in that test I was just sharing with you, advisors, 4 possible choices. But we're here live. We can do the real thing. Like, there's 6 possible answers, right? I mean, look, if you say the answer is 7, I am going to ask you to get up and leave now, all right? But there are 6 possible choices. So you've all been great with raising your hands, and I appreciate the feedback and the questions. Let's do one more. Everybody pick one answer and raise your hand high and proud for that, and let's see how we do as a group. How many say, Jeff, what a silly question? Of course, this guy spent all this time last year when he could have just added this up and taken it from one account that he wanted to. How many say 1? Raise your hand high. Be proud. Okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah, don't be shy. How many say 2? How many say 3? How many say 4? How many say 5? How many say 6? Some of you did not play the home game. All right. I think 4 people raised their hand for the correct answer, which happens to be 4. Yes, someone just did it over here. Always. Every single, somebody goes, 4? How did we get 4? Well, look, here's how we get 4. And by the way, for those of you who selected 5, the good news is you probably didn't have a penalty for your client for not taking the right amount. I'm assuming you had the IRA rule down where we can combine accounts. You may have just lost the client because you didn't get the answer, right? But for those who said 1, 2, or 3, you're putting your client in a position where they might have a penalty. Here's the deal. We hopefully all know the IRA rule. If you've got multiple IRA accounts, let's say 3 IRAs with a calculation of an RMD of $4,000 for one, $5,000 for the next, and $6,000 for the last, that's $15,000. Do whatever you want. Just get me $15,000 out of IRAs by the end of the year. Do 5 evenly from each. Do 4, 5, and 6 as it's calculated. Do 15 from one. I don't care. Just get $15,000 out. However, when we're talking about plans, the general rule of thumb is every single plan must be calculated and taken separately. There's one exception to that rule, 403Bs. Like or very similar to IRAs, you can collapse multiple 403B accounts together and take them from any 403B. So if we go back to our client, we count up distributions again. I have 2 IRAs. How many? 1. 2 401ks. 2 more, that's 3. And 2 403Bs. 1 gets us to 4. That's how we get there. Now, I was sharing this with a group a couple of years ago. An advisor came after me. He looked as white as the tablecloth in front of you all. I said, what's the problem? Are you okay? Are you sick? Do I need to get you an ambulance or something? He said, I just realized I made a huge mistake earlier this year. My biggest client turned 70 and a half, and I told him to take his IRA RMD from his 401k. I said, why'd you do that? He said, because we manage the IRA. Okay. A clue. Yeah, well, anyway, the end result of this was it was a $120,000 RMD. This was a very, very wealthy person who had accumulated a lot of money. And the good news was we were having this program in November, and he turned 7.5 earlier in the year. So we were able to fix the RMD issue. We had him take $120,000 out of his IRA. But if you have that large of an IRA, you know your other income is good. This person did not want an extra $120,000 of taxable income. Well, ended up going for a PLR, and his company, a large institution that many of you, every one of you would know, they spent an unseemly amount of money on their in-house attorneys to prepare this. I last saw the bill, it was over $70,000 to prepare, and that's not even including the IRS fee, right? Like, we want to avoid these things. We want to make sure that we're taking them from the right account. A couple notes here, just some additional pointers. There is an exception to this. If you annuitize an IRA or a 403B over a life or joint life expectancy, then that effectively becomes its own mini pension plan. It switches from the defined contribution section of the tax code over to the defined benefit section of the tax code, and you can no longer aggregate it. Annuitization. Some of you may use those GMWB products out there, right? The guaranteed minimum withdrawal benefit. It's not annuitization, so it could still be aggregated. Also, you cannot combine RMDs between spouses, right? Say, well, same tax return, who cares? IRS cares. You can't do between your own and an inherited, and you can't even combine between inherited of different decedents. All of those need to remain separate. All right, mistake number 8, not fixing mistakes when you find them. Look, we just said, maybe we've got a couple clients where we missed RMDs. They didn't take them from the right accounts over the years. Well, should we fix it or should we let it go? Too many people have the thought, I'll just wait 3 years, and if nobody catches me, I'm home free. Well, that's not good in general, but it's not even true in most cases when it comes to IRAs. At least not today. There's a proposal on the table that would change this. But today, there's generally no statute of limitations, right? And here's the reason why. Here's the reason why. Mr. Paschal had about $1.6 million inside his IRA, and he wanted to have a tax-efficient retirement plan. And you can imagine it would be really awesome to take that $1.6 million and convert it at a cost of $0, right? That'd be pretty cool. Now, you or I know that there's no reasonable way a person could do that, but Mr. Paschal saw maybe an ad in a paper from a very large, reputable accounting firm. I don't want to mention their name out loud, but amongst friends, let's just call them Fant Gordon. Does that work? All right. It's a public court case. Everybody can see this. It's Grant Thornton, of course. Grant Thornton was marketing this thing called a Roth restructure. And they said, if you pay us a small fee, anybody want to guess what that small fee was? $120,000. Yeah, we will help you convert your IRA to a Roth tax-free. So here's what they did. Paschal said, sure, I'll do that. I mean, if you think of it as a tax rate, less than effective 10% rate on $1.6 million, good deal. I'd be happy to pay $120,000 of tax to have $1.6 million tax-free. So Paschal goes in, and they have him open up a self-directed IRA. They move the $1.6 million into the self-directed IRA, and Paschal goes out, they create a company for him. They called Telesys. And they name Paschal the president, the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, the janitor, everything for Telesys. And what do you think Telesys was worth? Somebody said 0. I didn't say what should it have been worth. I said, what do you think it was worth? They did business valuation. Said, oh, it's worth $1.6 million. Well, it just happens to be what's in his IRA. Amazing. Now, this was back in 2002. Please keep that date in your mind. The contribution limit in that year was $2,000. They had him open up a Roth IRA, contributed $2,000, created another company, Westar, did a business valuation there. What do you think Westar was worth? $2,000. Oh my goodness. Wow, the stars were just aligning. Just happened to be what he had in his account. Now the two companies decide to do business with one another. Telesis says to him, Westar, right, he controls all the entities, he says, well, we'll pay you $1.6 million if you do for us nothing. He says, gee, that sounds like a great business deal. Telesis writes Westar a check for $1.6 million, and then Westar, having such a great year, revenue 1.6, cost of goods sold 0, declares a dividend of $1.6 million payable to the Roth IRA. He goes on and invests in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, all the other things we know and love, right? Well, years later, IRS effectively comes knocking and says, hey, Grant Thornton, either we're going to go after you or you can tell us all the people who did this so we can go after them. Hence, Paschal's in tax court, right? I think most people just said, all right, whatever you want, IRS, we agree, this was kind of cuckoo. But Paschal took him to court. And Paschal, the case you see here is in 2011. What was the year I asked you to keep in mind? All right, so you're Paschal's attorney now. What's your first thought as you go to defend him? Statute of limitations, absolutely. Now, you could argue fraud, but that's not what happened. And if that was the case, and if the court said it was fraudulent, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I would have gone, click, mistake 8, don't commit fraud, click, next, right? That would have been it. That's not what happened. Instead, Paschal said, statute of limitations, right? He held up his tax return, basically waved it in IRS's face, like, ha ha, I should have caught me sooner. And then IRS came up with the great argument. They said, but Mr. Paschal, we're not going after you for the income tax. This is a listed transaction. And by our rules, we say that when you make this sort of transaction, we treat this as a contribution to the Roth. And we have our crack team of mathematicians at the IRS working round the clock for several months on this, and they've come back and told us that $1.6 million is more than $2,000. And so therefore, you have a 6% penalty on $1.6 million for the last 8 years. Again, Paschal said, but my 1040, I filed it. And they said, Mr. Paschal, are you aware of where we report this penalty? 5329. Mr. Paschal, have you looked at the second page on the bottom of Form 5329? What's there? A signature line, which means you can send this in by itself, which in our definition effectively makes it tax return 5329. And Mr. Paschal, you did not file that tax return, therefore you have no statute of limitations. And the tax court said, good one, you win. Now, how many of you have clients who file Form 5329 every year for all of their, like nobody. And if you don't file it, you have no statute of limitations. So this idea of, I'll just wait 3 years, not so fast. I mean, think about this. Even someone who missed RMDs for their entire lifetime, now it goes to a trust, right? You want to have a really scary thought if you're the attorney in here? Now it goes to the trust or the estate where you're the executor or the trustee, and you distribute those assets. You may now have transferee liability under that because they can go back forever. Now, haven't seen a ton of transferee liability cases, but the IRS has used this no statute thing for a lot of people over the last decade or so. So this is not something that just popped up once. They've used this many times. I'm actually going to move through mistake number 9 because you've all had so many good questions, and I'm going to move to beneficiary form errors. And I'm going to close the way I started, saying if I can get you to realize that the simple things are really difficult, what does it mean for the actually difficult things? So I'll give you just a handful of situations that illustrate this. And first off, I think we all know, whoever came up with the expression where there's a will, there's a way was not an estate practitioner or an IRA expert, right? Like where there's a will, there's no way it's going to work out very well for our clients. And we can look at just a handful of cases to see this. So Kennedy versus DuPont, right? We say, okay, it's the beneficiary form. Well, in Kennedy versus DuPont, Mr. Kennedy had about $402,000 in his plan. Unfortunately, he and his wife didn't get along, so they were getting a divorce. And as part of that divorce, she waived her rights and said, I don't get these dollars. But dopey, Mr. Kennedy, never worked with a professional like you who said, okay, we'll update the beneficiary form. So sure enough, he dies. The plan says, the beneficiary, a legal document says, pay my ex-wife. But we've got a valid notarized spousal waiver saying, don't pay me, not my money, I get some other stuff. Well, it went back and forth until it went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, where they ruled 9-0. When does that happen? Pay who's on the beneficiary form. The ex-spouse got everything. There's a great quote from the court case, the daughter, Carrie Kennedy, saying, my father told me expressly he didn't want my mother to have one more red penny, but she got it all. You don't want that. And you say, Jeff, we know that. The beneficiary form is the most important document there is. Okay, fine. So let's look at Cajun Industries versus Kidder. Here, unfortunately, it wasn't a divorce, it was a death. And Robert Kidder did the right thing initially. Or, excuse me, Leonard Kidder. Robert Kidder was the son. Leonard Kidder did the right thing initially. He went and he updated his beneficiary form to name Robert and his two siblings as his beneficiaries. But then, after doing the right thing, Leonard Kidder did the wrong thing. He did a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad thing. What did he do? That's correct. He got remarried. That is right. Now, this Zoom is not going to my wife, right? I just want to make sure. It was the best decision he ever made. Of course he got remarried. Yeah. Well, he got remarried, and not 6 weeks after they were married, he passed away. She got everything. She wasn't named on the beneficiary form, but why did she get everything? That's right, ERISA, she was a spouse. Now, ERISA does say a plan can make the new spouse wait up to 1 year to automatically be the beneficiary. But in DC plans where the money is always going out, it's almost always, are you a spouse or did you have a spouse when you died? They are your beneficiary. In essence, when they say I do, they say, I do become the beneficiary of your 401k. And that's it, unless they waive out. So what could you do? How about this case here, Greenbaum versus Sandler? Could you have done what they did? Maybe use the prenup? No, why not? Of course not, because why would I ask the question if you could? But why not? That's right, not a spouse. If it's prenuptial, you're not a spouse yet. You can't waive rights to something you don't have yet. Well, interestingly enough, that's what happened with Debbie Sandler. She waived her rights, and then afterwards she said, I changed my mind. Now here's the best part, and I only know this from hearsay, but I believe it's true because it's too funny not to be. What did Debbie Sandler do for a living? ERISA attorney. All right. So you say, okay, well, we got to then Schwab v. Chandler. Chandler was an individual who was dating a man for a number of years and said, basically, if you don't marry me, I'm out of here. He said, all right, but I want my kids to get my 401k. So before we get married, I'm going to roll it over to an IRA, name my kids, and then we'll get married. And that's just what they did. Now, shortly after they were married, he died in a flash flood of all things. By the way, are you starting to notice a pattern here in the case? I'm just, all right, anyway. So he died in a flash flood. His new wife said, this is my money. This is not supposed to go to the kids. This was ERISA money. The protection should follow. The court said, nope. Once it left the plan, it was no longer ERISA money. He did this before he was married. He could do whatever he wants. So you say, all right, Jeff, we got it. If it's a plan, it's ERISA. If it's not, then it goes to the beneficiary form. Well, not so fast even there. The pension pickle. Now, this is a great case, especially for you all here, because this comes from the New York Post. It's a New York case. A New York City school teacher was involved here, and there's a headline you can't buy this good. Facts tell, stories sell. This headline read this: broke widower loses $1 million to in-law. I don't care whether you're an attorney, a CPA, a financial advisor, you cannot buy headlines that good. It's 15 years plus old. I would print this article out and have it on my desk and give it to every person I ran into. Here's the fact pattern. When this woman was younger, she started working for New York City schools. She wasn't married, so what did she do? She did what a lot of our younger clients did. She named her mother, her uncle, and her sister as her beneficiaries. Fast forward a few years, she found the man of her dreams and got married. And for decades they were married. And for decades, someone like you never ran her across her path and said, let me check your beneficiary forms and make sure everything looks right. Well, sure enough, she passed away first. And even though they were married for decades, and even though he was her husband for that decades of worth of time, you heard the headline, broke widower loses $1 million to in-laws. How is this possible? But this is the easy stuff, right? How is this possible? What did she do for a living? Teacher. And where did she work? New York State, that's right. So it was a New York State 403B plan. State and local 403Bs are not ERISA governed plans. No ERISA protection, no ERISA spouse protection. He lost it all. And these are just the 5 most straightforward cases. We could spend a whole day together just going through some of these. Things where my beloved children didn't include the stepchildren who were his only children because his stepchildren weren't children. Like, we could go on forever. But when the simple things are this hard, how about the hard things like NUA and advanced conversion planning and trust as beneficiaries? That's why it is so critical that clients have you as their guidepost, to have you guide them. These things are complicated. It's why it's so important for you to continue to attend sessions like this, and it's why it's so important for groups like the Federation to do this program, and I hope you support them as they've supported you here. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. I wish you all nothing but the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, very quickly, I'm the surprise guest today. About 2 weeks ago, I got a call that an attorney was needed, and so being a committee member, I was a good sport, so here I am. I looked at Jeff's presentation, and really he covered all the important things. So I thought, okay, what can I possibly add? And I realized that working at CNB, we see a lot of your planning acting out. We have IRAs in the branches as well as those that are prepared in our wealth management area. So it might be helpful for you to see some of the things that we're seeing. So the first thing, obviously, Jeff already mentioned this, 1099-Rs, very confusing to our clients. Why doesn't the QCD show up on there? Just as a matter of course, we started sending the transactions to CPAs so they have the documentation. And to Jeff's point, it's anything we can do to help CPAs at tax season is a bonus. So the other thing that we hear a lot is that the larger financial institutions are really restrictive when it comes to beneficiary designation. There's no reason for them to be this way. So I have 2 examples to share with you. The first is a situation where we had a client who wanted to make a charitable gift in a specific amount. And that amount was $50,000, and the rest should be paid to my spouse. Well, that was not acceptable to this other financial institution. They felt that was too complex. There's no regulatory reason for them not to accept a beneficiary designation like that. Another example is a situation that we had where a client had some really sophisticated planning going on, and the primary beneficiary was the spouse. The alternate, she wanted to follow exactly the planning under the will. Again, this was rejected by another institution that I won't name, but not a problem. You know, when you're dealing with one of the smaller, more local organizations, we're able to take these more complicated beneficiary designations. So again, we're here at the as guests of the Jewish Community Foundation, and so I thought I better talk a little bit about charitable giving. So I have some samples here. We've had a couple situations, let's see, where we've had clients who wanted to use part of their to use their IRA to make a charitable gift. But they're looking for an overall gift to charity of a certain percentage. So in other words, I have a situation where the client had designated in his will 30% to my brother, 30% to this group of friends, and 30% to charity. We realized that the best way to make this work, to get rid of any tax consequences, was to make his IRA payable 100% to that group of charities. But then you throw out of whack his will. So we simply had him add a formula to his will that adjusted for that gift. So in other words, do the math, add it back in, then divide. And that way he was able to avoid any of the taxes or any of the complications that Jeff was just talking about in paying out the IRA. Just a few other things to think about. Right now, we are really waiting to see one of these pretty challenging cases that Jeff mentioned with trusts. Believe it or not, the first thing that I thought of to talk about was administering trusts under the new Secure Act. And I did speak to my colleagues. None of us have actually had any of those situations yet. We're still waiting. So I think it's a good time to step back and look at any will you've drafted in the last 10 years and make sure that you're not going to create a situation with unintended consequences. Let's see. Also, we've had some situations recently where we had a disagreement between or a conflict in the beneficiaries under the will and a conflict with the beneficiaries of the IRA. And so we find that sometimes it's better to explain that reasoning ahead of time to the beneficiaries so that you don't get in the situation that we did where people were objecting to the probate of the will when they saw that the IRA was going to a completely different beneficiary. And I think that's the end of my time, and I think I need to turn it over to Jeff for questions, and I'm available as well.
Any additional questions for Jeff?
Oh, sure.
You $10,000, you're in for $10,000, okay, next. Tom.
Jeff, what do you see as the likelihood, it's already past one house in Congress, that the RMD age is going to be raised to 75 this year?
Yeah, good question. If I was setting Vegas odds, I'd say 8 or 9 to 1 that it happens. I am really hoping that they do it in one fell swoop to 75. Right now, there are competing draft legislation, one that would push it flat to 75, beginning in 2033, I think they're now back to. Another that would make it first 73 for some, 74 for others, and then still 75 for others phased in. Because everybody already gets their RMDs perfectly, we're going to make it more complicated. But will it go to 75? I'd say strong likelihood, which is kind of counterintuitive. They're talking about it as a way to help people save more for retirement. The reality is it's a gift to very wealthy taxpayers, right? Which happens to be for most of our clients. It's a few more years of no RMDs where we can do extra conversions at lower costs, et cetera. You might like it, dislike it, whatever your political thoughts and feelings are, like, it's fine. You're entitled to your opinion. But if we look at purely the facts, like, this is only generally going to help, those who are wealthy enough, and the idea that those who are not in a situation will be able to save more just doesn't run with the facts, because even those who are 70 and above who are still working, which is actually an increasingly growing percentage of the population, and prior to the pandemic, I don't know what the statistics are now, but it was about 32% of those 70 and above before the pandemic were still working. We often, our gut reaction would almost be to say, oh, well, it's got to be those people who need to work. The crazy irony and the sad irony to an extent is it's often not, right? If we look around even this room, right, it's oftentimes those who stay working longer are white-collar professionals because they can, because we don't go out and have to, break bricks every day. It's easier for us to do, and we don't need the money as much, but we're able to do it and we enjoy the work, and we can control our hours a little bit more. And so when you look at it, it's actually those who don't need it who continue to work more. It kind of extends that gap, so to speak. But great question. Thank you. Yes?
This is sort of in the nature of an 11th critical
Okay, I like 11th critical mistakes.
Yeah, okay. If I have a plan and I want to roll it over to an IRA, I wouldn't recommend this, but I'm allowed to take it myself and I have 60 days before I put it in to roll it over?
Yes,
Okay. Now,
but you will have withholding generally.
I'm now a beneficiary
Uh-huh.
of an IRA.
Mhm.
And I want to take this and roll it over. How much time do I have to do that?
No time. Yes, yep. Yep, that's a great point. So the point was raised, like another critical error would be that if you're a non-spouse beneficiary, you can't do an indirect rollover. So if you take that money in your name, it's effectively an unfixable problem and it's all taxable right away. Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah.
On the Secure Act and the 10-year rule, have all our industries given up and acquiesced to the IRS's interpretation of the 10-year rule for traditional IRAs? Is it
Yep.
really going to be a forced something every one of those years?
Yep.
without-
Good question. So effectively, just to reiterate, and for those at home, what's going on with the 10-year rule? Is it going to be RMDs within the 10 years? Is it going to be wait until the end of the 10 years, then everything as kind of everyone thought before the proposed regulations came out? I honestly have never been more 50-50 on something in my life right now. I have absolutely no idea. On one hand, right, if you read the regulations, the preamble, the IRS's logic, as much as I hate the idea of RMDs during the 10 years, it makes a lot of sense from the way the code actually reads. On the other hand, it is clear that Congress's intent was just 10 years. The IRS is getting a lot of hate mail right now in the form of comment letters from industry folks saying this is absolutely unworkable. And on top of that, if you buy the argument that you should have RMDs during the 10 years, it also means for the last 20 years, since we've had final regulations, you should have had RMDs during the 5-year rule as well for non-designated beneficiaries, like a charity, like the Federation, which has never been the IRS's interpretation. So either they're going to go back on that and say, like, we were wrong the last 20 years and we're fixing that now, or they acquiesce. I'm hoping, maybe even in a technical correction, they do it. If push comes to shove, I'm going to say 51%. We go to flat 10 years. Because even if you follow that through, it means you have 5 different paths for successor beneficiaries. There are 5 different RMD regimes that if you follow that through, it's even more complicated than that first level, which is already complicated in and of itself. So great question. Stay tuned. Yes? What's that? I think the IRS is going to try and come out with something before the end of this year, simply because people have died since 2020, and we got to know what to do. I'll tell you personally right now, unless someone is overly concerned, I'm generally saying wait, and if we have to make it up, let's do that. Unless someone was planning on spreading out the income anyway, which is, in a lot of cases, the right thing to do simply from a tax play. Unless it's a Roth. That's right. Then I want my 10 years and give me my 10. But the good news is if it's a Roth IRA, at least, it's always going to be 10 years with no RMDs in the interim. Because yes, because if someone dies before their required beginning date, then it's flat 10 years under the proposed regulations, and a Roth IRA has no required beginning date. So the only time you'd ever have a Roth with RMDs in the interim would be if someone had a Roth 401k or similar plan. They were over 72, was already taking RMDs and left it there for some reason, which, unless you needed like the asset protection, you'd almost always move it to the Roth IRA to avoid RMDs. So it is theoretically possible if a plan Roth, but for Roth IRAs, it would always be you get your 10 years and let it do its thing and grow for 10 years for sure. Cool. All right, well, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all. Yeah. Just want to thank you all for joining us. Please take the packets with you. All the information that Jeffrey presented is in there. Also fill out your evaluation forms if you haven't done so, and please sign out on your way out so you can get proper credits. I also want to acknowledge Sandra from my office, who's in the back somewhere, and also Terry from EPC and the Rivers Org. are in back helping us out. Thanks to our sound and AV crew as well, and obviously to the club. But thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.